Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mendicant Orders spread in the urban environment, typical topic of 13th century historiography. I made a video about Humbert of Roman that exemplifies in part the thinking of these friars regarding the moral implications of the city world, and so their duty, right, as mendicants to essentially redeem these communities, to especially prevent the spread of heresy. So this is a topic that can go different directions. Today we will stick mostly to the modalities, let's say, to the explanation of how, right, the mendicant orders spread in the cities, what is that brought them there, but also what did really made them settle the way they did, because you know that these orders were often, let's say, there aren't just typically the Franciscans and the Dominicans, but even in the former case, that you find actually a significant degree of heterodoxy, even of heresy down the line. I made a video about the struggle over Francis' legacy, the problem of the Joachimites, from Joachim of Fiore and all the sort of, in fact, astray paths that had branched up to the studium of Paris and all the scandal that derived from that. There is all the social issues behind this, like why did, which is all with sin and the moral issue of the evil of the world, like why did heresies spread in the cities? And say the most attempted review know my interpretation of this topic. We have also seen in other videos, there is, I think, a playlist properly on the Mendicant Orders, if you're interested, aside from the broader Christian one, like they're sort of like Chinese boxes to some extent. But just to be more precise, you can't just select that out for your tastes. The integration of the so-called Pauperistic-evangelical movements within the Catholic Church, which was a triumph of the papacy and of tradition, right, of universal authority, lay and ecclesiastical alike, by the way, because the thing could have never succeeded without the cooperation between the two powers, right? That's an aspect that gets somehow, passes under the radar to some extent, in as much we think mostly of the struggle, right, of the investiture controversy, this sense of, especially from a certain cultural side of the world today, the sort of malaise deriving from the hierarchy, the papal monarchy, this stuff. But actually, we are witnessing one of the greatest success in the history of human civilization, that literally saved the system for centuries to come, preventing further disgregation in the face of actually a major onslaught, right, ideologically, but also politically and even militarily, but especially socially, right, and starting from the most affluent cities in the Western Christendom. Just the other day I was talking about Bogomilism, the connections with this more universal Gnostic Manichaeism, fundamentally, that as a dualistic heresy was trying set to break apart, in fact, the system. And as such, and I will not digress specifically on that because there are theological implications. Today we do not talk about this, but it's important to contextualize the relation between the Mendicant Orders and the cities within this specific picture. Otherwise, you see, I already know now by habit, I would say that every time I make a video on things like the Mendicant Orders, Christian history in general, in spite of the fact that I go to great lengths to sort of explain the stuff and to point out why it is important, as a matter of fact, I get fewer views. But I don't care, because if I were just to follow that, there would be ever less sensitivity about these topics, right? And here what makes sense is literally the fact that without this chunk of history, and specifically the Christian one, the papal one, you can't quite understand the Middle Ages, right? I say it a bit here en passant, but extra, say, beyond at least today's topic specifically, to today's topic confines at least, but that's what we should start. Apparently, it's about being humble, at least honest with yourself, right? I have been studying medieval history for a long time now, and of course I feel as if I had just begun, and I must say that, my few cents about what I can say about the major misunderstandings, at least in the approach of the popular approach to medieval history, is exactly this, that it's a broader academic, scientific, and moral issue, of course. It's just how history is made today, which, in my opinion, doesn't make any sense. It's the reason also why we're collapsing or shrinking, at least as a civilization, is that hyper-specialization brings nowhere, right? Listing things, describing, rather than analyzing, not trying even dare to ask something that goes beyond it, that is to say, well, why did these people did what they did, or what was the actual belief of the time. This gets completely skipped. So the reason why I would get fewer views on a regular basis is obviously that people have not been told, because this is a problem I had myself when I began to study this history. You know that I do have actually a couple of titles that refer to history of religions in my degrees, but and history of Christianity. But let's say nobody really explained to me at university why things like, I don't know, the Mendicant Orders happened, or how their community worked and why, right? They would just describe that, but not explaining the cause. The same with monasticism, the same with why would people live this way? Why would they choose that? That's an answer that I've been given myself throughout, say, many different sources, combination, and I must say that things do make sense when you actually get down to the ultimate meaning of that. And so I realized it's as if I had to break a mold, or like I said, a thick wall of some sort, before getting to the, say, intellectual ears of the audience sometimes, or that. But of course I'm satisfied with my audience in general, because I realize that if you stick around, it's because you fundamentally like, because they say similar things even for different topics that are always intertwined with these, and so if you get that, you can easily get this too. And today we'll just make a bit of brainstorming for the sake of the aforementioned context. We talk about the 13th century, that, as you know, was the moment, in fact, of full affirmation of these orders, not just the mendicant ones, but the so-called Pauperistic-evangelical ones. They were called mendicant because, you know, they lived off of alms, fundamentally, and they rejected property to some degree, and there you realize, this could take dangerous directions. But in fact, the integration in the Catholic Church and the in exchange for the full obedience and theological orthodoxy was largely successful. The 13th century is the peak of medieval civilization. This was an enormous system. The cities were growing like crazy. We do not even have properly the, say, specific measures, because just from, paradoxically, the end of this in the 14th, the 15th century, start getting something more concrete. We do not even know exactly how big Europe was at this time. I made a video recently about, say, medieval European demographics in general. I gave some figures there. You can treat with a pinch of salt, but there is no doubt that the spread of the Mendicant Orders at this point in history, together with their religious influence, was not just felt above all in the cities, but properly designed to strike at them. Right? This was the deeply political and strategic objective of the papacy. The papacy basically managed to hijack these heterodox Pauperistic-evangelical movements by turning them from his side, and transforming them, his guns, against the same heretics within the same cities from which, in fact, these individuals had been spread. There are all the social reasons for this that we'll get also to in a moment, right? There is an interesting aspect as well, that is to say, even in those areas where the Mendicant Orders had been around from a longer time, such as, for example, Tuscany, the Mendicant Orders' influence was hardly ever felt in the countryside before the 14th century. We will see on another occasion. This is particularly relevant to highlight, in fact, the aforementioned dynamic. Like, these movements had been born in the cities from citizens. I made a video about St. Francis of Assisi that tells you, like, the broader picture there. This guy was a knight of this Umbrian commune that lived just in the typical context of the time. His father was a rich textile merchant. He participated to tournaments, he gambled, he loved, he went at war, he was captured. That's where he had also his revelation, always connected to the empire, and he decided to follow, to reject at least the false promises of the earthly dimension, and to start from his side his branch of and of course in that video go on explaining how also he had to regulate his in fact his rule because of papal orders, how he had what his beliefs really were. We tend to pacifisticize Christianity nowadays, and that's one of the first indicators that whoever thinks that Christianity is a pacifist movement of any sort doesn't know not just what Christianity is, has never known that, nor his parents or whoever taught him Christianity, but doesn't understand what religion is. There are many passages, I don't know, when Francis went to Egypt at the Crusades, etc., that really tell you what this whole thing, it was of the imperial Catholic tradition, and in the deeply military and religious meaning of the same concept. I mean, being a milas, right, in this context, means that this Francis was a professional soldier, and the top elite one in terms of like arms and armor training, collective, like these were the people from which the thing stemmed. I mean, the Dominicans, famously enough, they gave themselves basically a military order of some sort in the rigidity of it. It's a bit like, well, the full thing is with Ignacio of Loyola, with the Jesuits later on in the Renaissance, but just for telling you how similar like this necessity of discipline really was. We were just discussing it as far as even the Protestants go, paradoxically copying some aspects of these Catholic orders that they had rejected after the Reformation, but that deeply affected, in fact, returned into the development of the modern military, right, in the Dutch, in the Swedish armies, and the model that existed at that point. But it's quite fascinating. We can't, unfortunately, digress on it now. There is something fascinating in here, too, right? And there are naturally many reasons which explain the predilection of the cities, right, in their mission, right? The first is evidently the great rise in importance of the cities in the first place, right? If you look at basically everywhere, like up to about the middle of the 13th century, you realize that the city, which is this universe on its own that has been in great part completely removed from our, at least from a part of the West, let's say, vision of the Middle Ages, right, was the cradle, probably the single most advanced civilization existing at the same time. I mean, if you ask the average person in general, what is the Middle Ages? It's just a place, with some grass and a gloomy sky and some stinky huts smoking and some cow around, right? But the point about and which was in part the majority of the world at the time, in the civilized areas. But the part that is taken out is that all the system gravitated by this point around the city, and not just a little town like the ones of fantasy, sort of Lord of the Rings cinematic style of, medievalism. In fact, we're talking about massive, bulky, immense infrastructure with an enormous demographic concentration and especially wealth. Right, the concept that, again, in the ancient world, there weren't cities like the medieval ones in terms of crowd. There weren't even in terms of single wealth concentration. There wasn't in terms of commercial dynamism. Much of what we conceive, like, again, the great accomplishments of, say, engineering, etc., are in front of your eyes whenever you study the major 13th century cities that are not just, say, some dots on the map. But they are, in many cases, a true tapestry and fabric of large areas of Europe, especially the southwestern one, which is in fact one that doesn't get enough recognition in the first place. Also because it goes against a bit this idea of, say, this medievalistic fantasy base, mostly founded on essentially on a strictly northwestern idea of, and a very limited northwest, like not even to say Scandinavia or France. It's mostly just revolving around 15th century England, which is beautiful and should be studied and paraded more. But you see, because usually who uses this narrative is, no, because you must study the entire Middle Ages at things that were more diverse, which means passing from, this is especially an American thing, passing from medieval England, 15th century England, to, say, I don't know, some Arab place, right? As if the rest of Europe, by the way, was not also, in some cases, particularly more advanced or dynamic and big, right? Massively in a political, military, and social sense. And this is where I really can't, it's something I always, I never made a full video explaining this because it sounds, someone, again, as it happened to be discussed on Reddit, as if I were whining against the Anglo-American world per se. I'm a great fan of the Anglo-American world, without any dishonesty, hypocrisy, or sarcasm. I really think it's great, right? Let's add to that all what exists, right, within Western civilization, so it's even cooler, right? That's all I think, and especially when you realize how deeply ingrained our sort of interest for the Middle Ages, even subconsciously, is, right, how it became, even especially through social media, you have still evidently an interest in this kind of stories. But when you get that the entire picture is completely, right, altered, but in a way that basically destroys almost the entirety of it, you feel like what could really go so wrong in a first world culture to have this radically disoriented approach to such a massive pillar of human civilization, world civilization, like medieval Europe objectively was. I think I have an incredibly high opinion of medieval Europe. I think that it was fundamentally the single most developed era in the world. I mean, I don't think the Chinese really can compare, especially by the 13th century. I think that what happened in Europe in a way or another had de facto surpassed objectively whatever else had existed in the world. This is not to say, but certain places were bigger, say, or had more greater agricultural output, doesn't mean anything, right? Here we're looking at quality and actual power, and actually the same size of the system as a whole. The fact that it was, I don't know, politically fragmented, which is not even that completely true, at least compared, in fact, to the same contemporaries at the time, doesn't mean anything. In fact, the rest was not also more unitary, if not for maybe part some geographical approach to history that, of course, doesn't make any sense. But in any case, going back on track, it's obvious that the cities were just attracting, as a magnetic pole, the sort of more dynamic elements of the civilization. And as a consequence, but also because it had always been the case, cities were also the centers of Christianity. I mean, the Roman model had prevailed ecclesiastically with the diocese in the center of the city, and that's basically it, right? Even elsewhere where this had not been born like that, like Ireland, of course, with the development of say, the local communities had come to be pretty much the same. This had actually, as we'll see, another objective that was the one of, because these Pauperistic-evangelical movements had, as we've seen in many instances, even the prelude to the Gregorian reforms, such as the Pateria, the Bishop Counts, etc., had actually an anti-episcopal, anti-elite character, right? These were mobs of poor people, right? So in some ways, the papacy managed to control them and to bring them to the side of orthodoxy and obedience, also to be actually a papal leverage on episcopal policy within the cities, because in many parts of Europe, as you know, cities had become the center of episcopal signories that were at some point reluctant even to follow necessarily papal direction. I mean, at this point, actually, beginning in the 13th century, Innocent III made multiple videos about him, and we'll keep talking about him, of course, unavoidably. One of the single most important people in the entire history of mankind, by far, easily within the top 15, and had reached, in fact, the peak of Roman Catholic power. Basically, in virtually any country in Western Christendom was technically a papal fief by that point, this was also the acme again of medieval European civilization as such. So this connection definitely means something in the first place. But it had been a closely fought battle. I mean, the one against the heretics, but also the Muslims had been coming back, even as pretty late as the late 12th century, etc. In any case, now, with the integration of Pauperistic-evangelical movement, a great part of the work had been done, and now the papacy could use this orders to counterbalance at some point episcopal power. Could be more or less leaning towards this or that king, say if they had some problem with the papacy. Just think about later on Boniface VIII and Philip IV. They're allies, they're buddies on international scene, except, among each other they clash against each other, they beat each other, and all this stuff. So you really need that, because there are also there is a lot of power at stake, by the way. Rural society, as we were saying before, wasn't really that warring, right? There is this idea, especially those who complain about the Christianization of Europe, that some priest would have arrived in the countryside and, I don't know, oppressed the pagan peasantry, destroyed its idols. Actually, whatever the peasantry thought, and legitimately so, nobody ever gave a damn about, right? And guess why? Because the reason why there is a city, and basically every kingdom in medieval Europe was based on cities, and at this major centers, even in the earlier times, was the ipso facto realization of the city and the elite superiority over the peasantry. So it was over, right? There is not a chance for these guys. We've seen it in the peasant revolts of the 14th century, and disastrously and universally wrong, right? They fail completely. They do not achieve anything. They actually sink the peasantry even way more below, in relative terms, it had ever been politically, etc. The possibility of creating a fourth estate in the royal parliament failed, etc. So nobody really cared, and specifically about the peasantry, because if you actually look at where the major religious movements, especially in the 11th, the 12th century, same guys that had made the papal monarchy and that had won the investiture controversy, had actually had blossomed from at least a non-urban context, and of course, yes, a rural one, but we're talking about still monastic experiences. Hermetism. I made videos recently about Peter Damian. We'll comeback of monasticism, especially in the early Middle Ages, it feels crazy that I'm a channel based on medieval history in almost 2,000 videos. I haven't made a single one about Saint Benedict and the Benedictine order. Right, at some point up to the 11th century, basically, and technically still at this point, every monk thought to be a Benedictine, right? And just they had sort of different views on how to apply Saint Benedict's rule with the new challenges, etc. We can think of heretical movements like, for example, like the ones in central Italy that would bring to the rise of the reformers, but also the great experiences of France. Think about Citeaux. So especially France and Italy are the major centers here, because they're basically the most developed as well, and they have the most important cities. Cities that, however, exactly because of this escape from the war, I think the video made on Peter Damian is particularly relevant because it shows you how this duality, right? The idea that the city is the den of iniquity, where opportunities to sin lay on every side, but at the same time, just like the primal monastic, purpose since the Desert Fathers, the beginning of Pachomius and Antony, Christianity, all this stuff, early Christianity, was the one of actually coming back to the city, coming back to the world, and being an inspiration for the world to adhere to the monastic model, which was supposed to be essentially the mirror of heavenly Jerusalem on earth, right? And so there is a deeply cathartic and sort of ascetic process here. I've never even really made a video on this. It was an old thing, universal. There are connections, surely, with Buddhism, with other, monastic experiences. Also, the Islamic world had this thing, but it was their fort, right, to return to that pristine moral capacity that would not reject the world for the sake of it, but in order to transform the world, to come back to the world. In fact, this is yet another aspect that doesn't seem to be that definitely declined. I mean, in the Middle Ages was very strong. Today's monastic movements have surely lost a bit of that, at least, drive. And in general, people, as I was saying before, have really forgotten what the true meaning of this whole thing really is, right? Not just some strange, weird choice. Of course, there were lots of people that were sort of deranged and went astray, and all these heretic movements actually show that. I mean, the problem of, in fact, you see, literacy was spreading, but who was teaching these people? Right? The church made this enormous job of managing to discipline these groups and to bring them, to save them to orthodoxy. But how can you control that? I mean, we don't live in such a different time. And if you think about social media and all the garbage that is spread here and there, you realize what does control what your kids watch, hear, listen, right? It's not that they should be fully controlled, or prevented from here, but say, where's the guidance? Where's the authority? I think it's quite relevant that these movements were won over to back into Catholicism with the means of coercion of the 13th century that are utterly ridiculous compared to anything we have today's states, right? So, which is even a greater victory, morally speaking, because if you don't have that moral instrument, there's literally no physical way you can control these people, or at least there is, as long as the lay authority sticks on your side. But again, why should they? And, well, okay, we live in heavily secularized and modernized times. At the time, the elite understood things better, and in fact, these guys lost. The heretics. There was really who were these people at the end of the day? I mean, the cities, as we were saying before, were growing very fast, right? And they were because they were getting richer to a degree, again, that had been unprecedented in history, right? There were cities here that became, in these areas, that became literally, easily, and many of them, the richest in the globe, right? and very fast. Right, the European civilizational expansion in the Middle Ages, I don't know in proportion any other civilization that rose that fast, right, in proportion, like meaning, of course, with the industrialization things went much quicker, but again, in terms of actual, caloric potential, I literally have no other evidence of someone who exploded in that way. Maybe the Romans of the early era, say between the 4th to 3rd century BC, but and that would explain a lot of things, by the way. But in this sense, the Middle Ages still displayed an enormous force. And yet, again, this idea that the empire had been de facto broken, and so that the world had aged, brought people to find themselves already at the time without an adequate guide and not knowing exactly what to do with all the money that came to circulate at this point. You see, until the 12th century or even the mid-13th, most economy was really barter, was really in nature, right? From this period onwards, instead, you still have properly a financial dimension. You start having banks, you start having massive, like also kind of international market dynamics. We talked about this many videos. There is a medieval economy playlist if you're interested as well. And lots of people didn't know how to cope with this morally. It's a bit like today, the disease of abundance, but something lived throughout, I don't know, even the late 17th century, the late 19th, right? You have for the first time in your life and in history, actually, something that nobody ever had materially. But it turns out that you feel more miserable than ever. And why is that, right? So, in many ways, people were disoriented. They didn't understand what was going on. And yet there was civilization was being built up through the pain and suffering to fix this problem. And yet, in the church, there was also a branch that was pretty much aware of the fact that this system really needed more regulation. Especially, there was a significant number of rigorists, or even just people with very high moral standards within the church that reacted to this socio-economical development by anathemizing that. We've seen in that aforementioned video how in 11th century Italy, Peter Damian, who was more truly a hermit than he was ever a cardinal, but that was perfectly able to manage both dimensions with an enormous personal strain and capacity and control. But the same can be said for 12th century Benedictine monks like Guibert de Nogent in France or Rupert of Deutz in Germany, that were really aware of the mess that the world out there really was, and especially within the city, the immorality, the illicitness, the things like robbery, right, that connected properly with this shrewd economical practice were being felt strongly. There was also a lot of anti-Jewish feeling regarding this, because you know that many Jews had been basically settled in some areas. This is especially true for Central Europe, as, first of all, outsiders in that case, differently from other parts of the continent, where at least they were present for actually a very long time, more than a millennium. But especially in a political sense, because they were used by the monarchs to handle money and making towns develop at the expense of the ethnic nobility that hated their gods. It sort of spread eventually that sort of nationalistic ideology of anti-Semitism that we know today, because technically the monarchs were still trying their own way to sort of return to the imperial Catholic tradition. Instead, of course, these nobilities made the states fail, most notably in Central Europe, throughout the medieval and modern age, and they sort of made the system crumble further. So this idea of corruption, right, of the rich in the city that, however, would pollute the poor people, because of course they were they had the weakest moral antibodies, just like, let's say, talking about poor people in a moral, but more in a moral than a material sense, right? There are poor people materially that are able to elevate themselves from that because they're morally strong, right? But unfortunately, the average it's not going towards that direction. Most people do really get, after all, rich for somebody else's merit, which is actually the real poison here going on. But also because they lack individually that control and sort of morality, and this is what these clergymen were realizing, really. There was a quite intense immigration phenomenon as well. I mean, the reason why the medieval cities had grown so much was not that the people inside were copulating like rampants, rather the fact that lots of people were moving in from the outside. These were essentially come to work in the suburbs outside the city, working inside of it during the day, staying out during the night, and hoping for a better future. Right? There was this saying, the air of the breeze of the city makes you free, which was referring at least to the fact that many of these peasants were escaping from feudal constraints, especially in those areas where the city was really coming to rule over the vassals, and that's quite interesting, by the way, because actually there were the same or even more powerful elites as militaries, as knights in the cities, but still the city, in fact, for this reason, attracted more and more clients in that direction. But many of these peasants were, if you want, communistic-minded. This ideologies had always existed since ever, right? And the sense that, of course, they lived a miserable way, and that they wouldn't really improve more than much their situation, and or the same greed and spoil, let's say attitude towards this marvel of civilization that they would, however, be the ones they had to make work if they really wanted to have, brought them to develop the usually classistic, socially envious feelings towards the elite. And so, as we know, there were open revolts against especially the power of the bishop, that was naturally based in the city, and so that's why it's more typical, at least in the majority of Europe, or the ruler of all or part of the city, right? So the problem is, you're poor not because you're a failure of a person, but because somebody is actually doing better than you, and so attack everything that guy represents. Bishops had really always done a great job to rule the cities since antiquity, and they actually much of the welfare systems, the hospitals, all these congregations that helped the poor were actually run by them, and with a considerable degree of expense. There was a genuine, it's not that all these figures were clean or moral, whatever, but generally speaking, the system did work, right? So that's what matters. It's not the man, but it's the divine institution in itself that truly matters, also for your own salvation. So there had been issues regarding this. I mean, today we talk about the 13th, not the 12th century, but in fact, in the latter, there had been significantly violent movements directed properly against elites with bloodshed issues. That's the heyday of the heresies. In fact, they were taking up this specifically violent socialistic character. The canons of the Second Lateran Council in 1123 and the Third in 1179 had denounced in one fell swoop the role of especially the moneylenders in economic life, their misdeeds, the fact that in many ways they were profiting out of the misery, the moral misery of people, the scandals provoked by the influx of prostitutes that attracted by these great urban centers, as well as the development of same heresies, and especially in the south of France, in Occitania, right, where the Cathar movement was spreading, which is purely communistic, vegan. I'm not kidding. These people literally were vegans. They thought it was sinful. They basically, their purpose was actually to kill themselves. They denied sexual differences. Does it remember you anything, right? Classistic, socialistic, when not communistic, and you know what this actually means. Of course, not all those who perished in the Occitan Crusade, in the Albigensian Crusade, were actual agnostics, but there were, right, and there was this social, again, it's just imagine society nowadays, right? How can you actually distinguish cleanly, fully, right? It's like when the bishop said, kill them all, God will recognize his own, which everybody says, oh my God, it was a terrible thing. You look at, this is how evil the bishop, well, aside from the fact that it was a very well, internationally recognized law to massacre everybody who resisted in arms, right? But you couldn't quite have a city resisting against, by the way, universal authority if you don't have the population siding, the decisive moral majority of the group siding for the defenders. This is basic, like ABC Clausewitzian theory. Of course, the bishop was fully right in that. God, he had a bit of, of a bitter remark there. God will recognize his own. If there is anyone, has to be recognized in that regard. But the world is a jungle, and if you are not really into these things, you can be sure that nothing will happen to you, or at least it will anyway, but not necessarily for this kind of being finding yourself randomly defending an heretic city against papal authority. Well, that's and the lay one that supports it, of course. So in any case, aside from that, we have a malaise, generally speaking, manifested even by great minds like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who accused the students that were, by the way, multiplying in the cities. It's just like today, right? In past generations, much fewer people had degrees. Now every kid has one. Of course, it's completely worthless, but realize the parallelisms with what is happening today, right? Including the later crisis of the system, right? And these were all indicators that had accompanied this growth, anyway, that has magnificent, had also been this unregulated. And the reason why St. Bernard was concerned, aside from, say, the deeper theological, philosophical inclinations, was the fact that, of course, these students were largely interested in sort of subversive ideologies that distanced them from their serene and respectful meditation on the gospel. And he was right. I mean, an Apollonian, there is never like Apollonian without Dionysian. I mean, those students were radicals as young people, but surely many of them turned out to be good Catholics later on, when they would teach themselves from some chapter. But the risk was for this thing not to be controlled, as always. These are forces you need to redeem yourselves, to kill in order to redeem yourself. But they may kill you if you are not strong enough to resist. So Saint Bernard opposed this lifestyle by praising naturally the austere joys of contemplation in the desertum, which in Latin doesn't stand like with the place with the dunes and the palms, but desertum means like properly a place where there's no one, the wilderness, right? You could have been in the iciest northern Europe, and where many, in fact, monks had taken refuge even during the migration. And that's how Saint Benedict, but also other ones, had started before. If you look at the Lorraine Islands, but always with the purpose of going back in the city to reveal, like to make the community come participate in your own spiritual perfection. It's not a coincidence that Cistercian monasteries would be located deep within the woods, isolated and surrounded by nature. It's a way of, again, of spiritual refinement, but always aimed at being connected with the world. Never make the mistake of thinking that monks didn't travel at Similia. This was a bit the sitch at the beginning of the 13th century when the first Mendicant Orders came around, at least meant properly as the ones that would make it like to lead the Catholic movement in this, up to the highest theological teaching. The cities were the arena of these guys. I mean, think about Assisi in Umbria and the various cities around where St. Francis operated. The wealth, the power there was being criticized. St. Francis abandoned all his goods in front of his father. He chose his life of absolute poverty. This was a very harsh, provocative, tough concept. Like St. Francis was, again, like the pacifistic mentality. St. Francis' character was incredibly hard, right? Because you can't, you must be that strong spiritually in order to even just think you can do this for the world itself, following Christ, and what he actually means, which is another thing that we seem to have lost track of. Read the Gospels, to the least, but also the rest of the New Testament and the Old one as well. Communal institutions would sanction, in this sense, the exercise or abuse of power, right, within themselves, right. Too often they were used to crush the poor and the peasants. The idea is that, of course, there was a great harshness also from the side of the elites. This is not to say the elite were, again, always great and successful. They had a unified empire of some sort, so obviously there were abuses. We're talking about a world in which the average human existence is one of traumatically violent, moral and material reality constantly, right? So to levels that we can't even imagine nowadays by default, and how they affect. This is not about saying, but this place of the world is bombed now, there are refugees. But you don't understand. This is the entire world like this. Right? It's a completely different mental horizon. This is not about an accident or some disaster here and there. This is the basic lifestyle of people that see 1/3 of their children on a deathbed, that do not have, say, light at home, electricity at home. They can look at the sky, like even the positive things. After all, where's the last time that you actually took a clean, good look at the sky without light pollution? It's a terrifying world, right? The women died of childbirth, like crazy, right? And the life expectancy was much lower, and today there were lots of untreatable illnesses. To at least for the overwhelming margin we can do today, you could die of literally nothing. Everything had another shape, and yet. What amazes you the most about this is how dynamic these people were, how much they actually traveled, how much they actually knew. The idea of the Middle Ages where nobody moved, nobody knew anything, it's completely invented, right? Of course, yes, the majority of people lived mostly where they were born and whatever, but let's say the sense that they wouldn't perceive the dynamism around this is completely false. So there were big issues, including the one of Languedoc that we referred to before, that that is virtually an entire chunk of Christian Europe that is turning heretic to escape the centripetal draw of Capetian France and the papal monarch, right? And that is not just these pure martyrs, whatever. They are copying literally the entire papal hierarchy, including the Inquisition, except everything is turned subversively to that aforementioned Manichaean creed. And the County of Toulouse, especially, is at the center of these issues. It's a major French principality, at least Occitanian principality. I made a video about the County of Toulouse back in the day. And it's a huge problem, because aside from the different religious inclination, this power is backed by the Catalans. It's a dangerous situation, which it can't go towards further disgregation. And the despicable fact is that large part of the population had supposedly adhered through their hatred towards the establishment in general. I mean, you can't fully say to the church and the clergy, but it's as if, like today, I mean, how many populists do we know that, of course, do not know anything about the world, but that they must have an opinion about it, that, of course, is not founded to any extent, and even if they were right, do not literally link one thing to another, so they're completely dangerous, and, and of course, just per se, that they are from the wrong side. And this takes yearly familiar direction all the time historically. And at least the positive thing is that these people always lose, right? Even if they make it to tear down the system, they're the first one to get massacred in a bath of blood. And so at least, it's true that divine justice always, gets to everyone what they deserve. Let's say, the Cathar influence, the Perfecti, also the Valdensians, that however ended up even as persecuted by the papacy to support the Catholic Church massacre of the Cathars, always remembered that, like just fans of Catholic crusades, and supporters of pseudo-Protestantic anti-humanity, that people, of course, back in the day were, after all, more intelligent than you are, and it doesn't take much, but it would take much for you to be as intelligent as them. And that's exactly why Francis and Dominic chose the cities to counter the heretics. This is especially the Dominican specialty. In the case of Francis, it's mostly about showing the material poverty, right? And in that sense, the moral superiority. True, this is interesting because the Dominicans were a bit more intellectual, and it would end up not just being regimented or the earliest in the Catholic Church, but also providing with the properly the hierarchy, the discipline, the organization, that instead the Franciscans were very heterodox. A branch of them, in fact, again, turned heretic at some point. Francis had to readjust the rule, as we said before. So there were issues with that, because of course it tends towards a communistic concept, but it's not, right? Just again, it's not those people, oh, Jesus was the first communist man. No, he wasn't. Aside from the fact that it was full of communists before him, but really natural communists, but he isn't preaching communism at all. Even when he deals with, yes, the story of the difficulty of the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven, all this stuff, but that's not what he means in a classist or communistic way. It has nothing to do with that. But that's where the Mendicant Orders, to make the long story short, begin their pastoral mission for the desire to lead the city dwellers to salvation. right? And a lot of this, especially again in case of the Dominicans, but also Franciscans, was connected with public debate, right? The priority was preaching in the city, and of course everyone could counter you, could preach these values. Somebody said, no, I disagree with that. Could say I'm a Catholic, and I think you're just acting for, the devil in Rome and all these kind of things. And so that's why they had to be instructed and educated over time, etc. And but people at the time that, of course, were much more aware of the traditional spiritual issues were really concerned by these debates, because really they would flock to listen to these debates, and as they were very concerned with their own salvation, as they felt their souls being threatened by sin. There are beautiful pictures. I think the first one, if you go to the beginning of the video, is one of my favorite in absolute terms, which is Giotto's, this is from the frescoes of St. Francis life, if I'm not wrong. That is the overthrowing of the devils from the city of Arezzo in Tuscany. And you can see the devils flying away from all the beautiful city towers, etc. Giotto is likely later in time, but I mean the architecture would be pretty much the same, and you can perceive here properly the evil inhabiting these cities, and how these people would properly visualize through this beautiful art that sense of threat, right, of danger, of these monsters living within it, because life was, again, that crude. Evil was that was there really in the face of everyone. So even if this is more metaphorical, allegorical, symbolically, it's still pretty spot on. And of course, people would understand that immediately, right? They would all recognize those devils in people they knew or themselves, which is actually the point. There were also other dynamics that naturally attracted the new orders to the cities. In many ways, the mere demographic increase was this sort of exercise gravitational force on anyone, right? If you preached again in the countryside, we would listen to you for. Those were just peasants. They were really just living to survive, to barely survive. They didn't have too many. Maybe they we do not know. One of the great mysteries that because they didn't write, nobody really cared. Like, it's what literally a medieval peasant would say about these things. But we can imagine, like today, a pretty split situation in which actually among the lower classes, a good part actually is still very conservative, and maybe does not understand the point, still sinning in many ways, populistically, etc., but at least deciding from sort of a right, let's say, that has positive aspects in it, let's say, because at the end of the day, that populism all goes towards one direction. But again, these people had much else to think about compared to today's fourth estaters, and they still work for the order, and everything would sort of make sense, right? Because still the elite wasn't, or at least those who could be living in the city were partly exceptions. This is actually not so true, especially in Italy, as many people basically lived in the city at the peak of urbanization than in the countryside, right? But in general, like we trace those dynamics. I mean, you can speak also about a textile salaried worker being pretty similar to a peasant at the end of, I mean, they were the same people to some extent as we've seen as immigrants, but also in their actual occupation of daily fatigue, right? It would absorb them entirely. Let's say money, like means to sustain oneself, were more easily to be found in the city, and given that these were mendicant orders by definition, the only way to live through alms would, but also thanks to the pious foundations, hospitality, etc., would give a lot to sustain their communities. That's how the same heretics in many ways had been living, and as the dispossessed were living on, in fact, welfare state, technically, and spitting on the system. But that's the thing. There is also a sense of freedom in the city, as we were saying before. Like, the seigneurial regime is not that strong there. The network of feudal bonds is looser. Especially the middle estates are, as you know, pretty. They allowed their liberty at least, and this had been sort of the target, the Schwerpunkt, because they were the people who handled the actual money, who had made it through money lending. It wasn't only the Jews at all, right? Especially in the richer cities of southwestern Europe. I mean, there were ways to go past this. At the end of the day, even in the late Middle Ages, the entire Catholic world accepted that the interest rates could be seen as a cost for the maintenance of the money, after all, and so there wouldn't be actually anything wrong morally. But originally, like these crafts were forbidden. For example, Dante's father was a moneylender. And hell, well, thanks to him, in part to that too, we had the voice of medieval civilization. And you see, we're looking at these. Just I quoted Dante. Will say I made a series a couple of years ago for his 700th death anniversary that deals in part even with these issues. And as you know, he was fully Catholic and admiring, of course, enormously the Mendicant Orders, its saints, etc. So that can be an interesting series if you're into especially late 13th, early 14th century Italy and these areas where these orders had began, with the Franciscan one specifically. The friar preachers chose to settle quite close to schools, right? The Dominicans, again, had this greater mission of countering intellectually the heretics, right? So this would place the friar preachers at the properly heart of the great urban centers, and would bring them later again to spread this educational model also to the Franciscans, while the latter, the friars minor, in fact, would mostly be about this sort of testing their physical limits in terms of material poverty, etc. But they would be quick to follow in the footsteps of their Dominican brothers. It's fair to say that the integration of these movements in the Catholic Church was quite fast. By the 30s of the 13th century, at least the first two Mendicant Orders had already established themselves in this urban orientation, and basically anyone else because there were really many others, right? Aside from I don't know, the Umiliati, the Beguines, etc., but that they're sort of more famous. But there was a myriad of them at the time that also, like, we do not have a true history of, because they were all sort of fragmented. Many of them were really poor people. They didn't have an education, so we will never fully know how many, how in what did they differ, really. But the example of the Dominicans and the Franciscans would essentially make lots of them just to join them and or found other groups, other orders on their basis, with some slight difference that had eventually to be sanctioned by the Pope, and things would happen in this direction. Now, this was the victory of Catholicism. There is a dynamic in this urban settlement that topographically is fascinating as well. Around the mid-century, still, right up to that point, let's say, the mendicants had mainly settled in the outlying quarters of the cities. So together with the poor, together with that mass that, as we've seen, they had in part come to save, to counter, etc., and to really discipline, eventually through their example, right? So we're talking at some point of places situated beyond the city walls, right? At this point, many new city walls, city rings were built around the earlier one. We're talking about even 3 or 4. And this is fascinating because it tells you physically, materially, how many people were coming to live there and how much the cities were expanding to need to protect these groups. There is an interesting aspect from the side of the city, and especially the bishops in the cathedral chapters. That is, these orders were sort of looked upon with suspicion, in part because, as we've seen, they were akin to the heterodox, but also because, of course, the episcopate understood that the papal blessing after the regimentation of these movements had something to do with the political interference in their ecclesiastical affairs from the side of Rome. The popes helped, in fact, these groups to be normalized, as we've seen, and to just even, contacting the bishops, explaining, how they should have been dealt with, etc. There are some instances in which some of them were just essentially settling in areas that around some churches that the surroundings of which had yet to be urbanized. So in part there is a rural phenomenon as well, but primarily the thing is in the city. The friars were, generally speaking, themselves sort of happy, let's say, to be in these suburbs, because from one side they had to show they were sound like the other people, because they were poor. They thought in part, surely, that the episcopal elite was also that more at least manifesting some of the material problems that the same movements had come to criticize, but at this point they had to be explained, and so they were essentially blessing the order, but keeping a watching eye themselves on the same bishops, in a way. It was also a way to just greet more quickly the people who were coming from the countryside. Just if you lived in the suburbs, those would be the first communities you would meet. The parishes were not particularly open, again, to these outsiders anyway, until, at least, there was, from the after in the second half of the 13th century, a phenomenon of true urbanization of the mendicants. So a relocation within the city walls, and the construction of monasteries, beautiful churches, etc. So the process that had eventually brought the same normalization. The Catholic Church had somehow accepted the necessity of having property, assets. This was fundamental. This is what, for example, the main fracture within the Franciscan order had caused most problems, because these groups were largely increasing. I mean, when Francis was still alive, there were people in England, in Germany, that had created their own Franciscan movement. They didn't even know who he was, right? He had never been there, and so the whole thing was growing somehow unregulated. You can imagine all the issues caused by this, but as we've seen, at least they were theologically normalized. But again, the need to organize themselves, even just having a housing, somewhere to stay, entailed that somebody had to own at least this property, had to administrate it, And so according to some of them, this was a sin. The others were more practical, and just like the bishops, like saying, the church does have a possession, we do not own it personally, but we administrate it as officials. So that's the struggle still between, again, the elite and the sort of fourth estate mirrored in the circumstances, because there are always some compromises you have to make. So it's important, morally speaking, if you're seeking to reach the absolute perfection, like how you approach your, for example, your same material possessions. Like it's a tough choice at a point when you realize that you're basically being softly killed, poisoned by your own ease, it's not the fact that you actually own something, like the communists complain about, just because they want it in your stead, but it's because this patch that you put on the mistake doesn't quite resolve the mistake per se, and so you get dependent on the ease, on the luxury, but you do not necessarily do anything to fix the problem that is in your soul. Thus, paradoxically, some friar minors wanted to remain in their financial precariousness and insecurity, because this to them would constitute a fundamental part of their vocation. This, again, could happen for different personal inclinations. It is not necessarily about, pure intentions. Again, everything was pretty messed up everywhere, so these movements in some ways were no different. But still, the conclusion of this, with, of course, the fact that not just this order still exists today, but that, of course, there is a Catholic, consensus now on such issues, and that, as it was normalized at the time, after all, well, it's still a big deal. Again, scandals, problems happen everywhere. Again, it was one thing to win this movements over to Catholicism, but let's say, or to Orthodox in the first place, because everybody technically thought to be a good Catholic, right? Aside from the sort of greatest excesses of Catholicism at Similia. But another thing was to maintain this discipline, to again organize, to uniform these movements. Just imagine that the world had never quite seen such large, communities being regulated in this fashion, with this level of uniformity. So it's a huge deal. Just talking incidentally about, the Teutonic Knight's habit. Made a video on that for my dress, as a sort of military dress series. There is a becoming, right, at these things. It's not just like overnight things change, and somebody has to make them work, especially in the 13th century with the communication of the time, etc. Some Franciscans were so, concerned with these issues that they preferred, and still when Francis himself was still alive and kind of okay with the former settlement, to withdraw to hermitages, and even voicing their hostility towards the changes that were taking place. This fringe would be called the spirituals, and we'll perhaps see them better in another video. Naturally, everybody was free, right? But of course, to be part of that community, you had to stay to the rule. And this had given some edge to the St. Francis, as we've seen, because, again, we have the rule, and there was a florid historiography on the person, on the figure, the context, etc. But we do not fully know what this person believed. Everything was, something more lived than said, right? This is yet another aspect of these experiences that truly called the individual to a real sacrifice, right? Not just a wishful thinking, sending prayers of good vibes, and on social network, these people were really committed. Like, it's one, like, I don't know, maybe just someone who joins the military understands such a thing nowadays. I remember also in my experience, like, you take that step knowing how much it costs, but that's where fate has to lead you to understand that you will be better once you have taken that step. And that's a choice that we make in everyday life to a greater degree, but never to the size of these guys. I mean, living in the wilderness, in the literal wilderness, and surviving out there, eating roots or something, whatever. I don't know, maybe my grandfather, when he, during World War II, went on living on a mountain to escape certain issues, right, and had a foot frozen, had to eat grass, like, that's the kind of things that you are able to do. And my grandmother walking kilometers every day to bring secretly food to him, well, that cooperation exists, but you see, right, how life goes, right? Hardly anyone today even approaches that, and those were just emergential moments, terrible times in history. But that still, we are so, say, in a sense, fortunately detached from, but in the negative, say, in the positive aspect that can come out of it, something we should all feel. And sometimes you have to appreciate, in fact, that truly what pain represents, because this is fundamental to the life of a Christian. Pain as glory, or pain as a revelation, right, of yourself. There is so much behind it, and I count on discussing this stuff at some point as well. What else can we say about this? There is all an evolution that I discussed in other videos about the mendicants that have to do with the ultimate, of course, settlement in the city, the full integration in the urban environment, the positive that the laymen, especially the bourgeoisie, began to see in these groups. Because you see, aside from these mendicants, etc., but there was something about the friars and other orders that allowed different orders and down, even hierarchically, depending on the degree of commitment, that would give the lay man the possibility of being both in the world and in this and out of it in these groups, to the degree of spiritual nurturing that they deemed fit for themselves. This was very important to comfort lots of people. The intended task of the Mendicant Orders at this point, also by papal mandate, was to lead laymen to penitence and holy confession. In other words, they say it was a concurrent role to the one of the traditional, of the secular clergy, which created problems as well, because, for example, now these many laymen would just leave in their testament lots of wealth to the orders, while not given to the local churches. Were problems of this kind, and etc. But the ultimate point is the same. After all, why all this, right? Why this movement? Why this wolf? Well, because of salvation. Because people want to know at that point of their life things are going to go in the right direction. It's in many ways just by itself is wishful thinking, but these measures are supposed to provide you with a sort of better context, right? A better condition to start reflecting on your life and your accomplishments. There is a lot in this sense of repentance, of hope, right? Of course, and how you have to manage your life, your goods, etc. So I'm checking here how many. Well, we made already 9 videos about the Mendicant Orders. That's good. Let's go on like this. And as I was saying, the say urban centers were also a place where people would participate more communitally in this broader confession, if you want. There was more sort of reflection, more exposure to these problems. More people could listen, for example, to the friars speaking, and they were invited to convert. They would listen about God. I mean, there is a general positivity, like also in the spread of literacy. See, all these movements were, including the Inquisition, that, as we will see now, was basically in the hands of the Mendicant Orders, were actually wanted by the people, were used to comfort their beliefs, to perfect their knowledge. They went in parallel with, again, the increase in literacy. They had a massively positive impact in the history of world civilization. Together with the development of the world church, as a matter of fact, so that everything is supportive and coherent. Interestingly enough, especially in Italy, heresy, as we've seen, was essentially a urban phenomenon. And so after 1233, the Dominicans and the Franciscans were officially entrusted by the Pope exactly to instruct the Inquisition process. This is particularly important because these guys had become sort of specialists in spotting, in fighting the heresy. They knew where, let's say, the root ideas came from. Let's say, of course, the bishops were qualified to do that, also other priests. But one thing, in a sense, was it's like the prodigal son, right? A bishop would normally come from a noble family, maybe of the same city, maybe knowing very well these issues, but still, being from another milieu, right? Generally, bishops were, again, the let's say the second sons of, great feudal families in Europe, etc. So in some cases, as you know, they had quite a even a lay secular lifestyle. I mean, many of them in this context, about in Germany, in Italy, they were pretty warlike. They went at war. They did lots of interesting things politically. So they were thought to be sinners by some of that degree as well. The Mendicants instead were won over from the mass of the heterodox, and so psychologically speaking, and culturally, they came from that sort of scum of the earth, and they knew closer what that moral material misery was about and where the mistake really was, right? So in those regions contaminated by heresy, their houses became true tribunals where the suspects of heresy would be interrogated. And this is interesting because it's the same time in history in which prisons properly start being created. I mean, before there were just corporal punishment, they would kill you, they would hang you, they would torture you, they would confiscate your goods, whatever. But prisons cost, like, maintaining a person there, what for, right? Instead, cities, especially if you look at places like, again, saying in the Italian city-states and other great monarchies, start building prisons where they keep mostly political enemies. At this point, basically, would be by default accused of heresy if you were just a guy that, fought against the Guelph Alliance or something like that, even if you were a very good Christian. But here we're talking about a bit like the bottom level, right? The average, the suspicion of heresy, whatever. Franciscans and Dominicans were pretty darn good at what they did. And this gave the same citizenry a great sense of security, right? I can't stress enough how positive the Inquisition historically was. I mean, this is widespreadly recognized in all the most updated historiography on the topic. the Inquisition had a massively effective regulating, disciplining, educating, and comforting role in the development of European civilization. This entailed some sort of authoritarian role, which, of course, brought the friars to take up some different tasks and offices. For example, they weren't really operating on their own. You see, in order to instruct a trial for the Inquisition, they were actually ordered to do so by those who decided it in the first place, so the actual ecclesiastical power, right? The Pope, Archbishop, Bishop, whomever, right? They were acting now together with them. They weren't enemies, right? There were many roles that it could play, such as agents of political propaganda serving the Holy See. This is mostly typical. I made a video about this, which was among the very first of Schwerpunkt, how in Italy, on the occasion of the great conflict between the Emperor Frederick II and popes like Gregory IX and Innocent IV, the single most vicious, ineffective, and smart, and intelligent, and powerful, and successful propaganda was at play, right? This is a world in which most of the novelties are, of course, spread orally. And so, yes, we study this period because it starts being well documented through the written sources. But of course, we lost irremediably, and it's very painful for any historian or any history lover, the voice, the sound, even the smells, like the atmosphere. Like, it's something we can't properly understand. And a lot of this world was still legally, politically oral, right? And so we do not know what this propaganda was about. It was truly, again, I mean, in a technical sense, but then we know it from the written sources. Things like the Frederick II was an antichrist, the Joachimites, for example, that they were so much connected with the spirituals. So literally that it was the end of the world that Frederick would have died, because it was the true Antichrist who was taking over the world, and then Christ would arrive. Of course, when he died, nothing of this would happen. So there is a very smart and in this sense, intelligent, honest friar from Parma, Salimbene, who wrote a very famous chronicle at the end of the 13th century, said, I believed that, but I was wrong. How many people today, about, I don't know, Trump or Biden or whatever, would be able to say that, just not to lose face in front of whatever, pro or against vaccine mandate policy they would make. Nobody's asked anymore, right? Nobody is really accountable, apparently, right? It's as if we all had allegedly any right but no duty. And of course it means that our rights mean zero, and that's exactly how it should be. So it makes you think. Now, in Europe during the mid-13th century, this is all what was going on, and together with, again, the clash between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, the big game, these are the years of Francis, of Dominic, are the years, again, of Innocent the Third, the Albigensian Crusade, the Battle of Bouvines, of Otto of Brunswick, of Philip of Swabia. Let's say it's really that mess, right? The Mongol invasions. You see, the world was really. You see, some of the moments of greatest prosperity are also the ones that still bring the greatest concerns, and that's how it should be exactly. I mean, it's not just a matter of, let's say, not that everything, when things go better, problems stop, right? There's always something wrong. You see, if everything had gone truly perfectly, European civilization would have come even beyond that. But of course, we live in a fallen world that always spirals down. especially in terms of moral standards, and so we are firmly aware of these issues. The more we study Christian history, I think it's crucial. I mean, ecclesiastical history, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, is just one of those things you can't do without. Again, I understand, as I repeated from before, that at the beginning one does not understand it. And one that is not given, nobody in this culture, in this time, like even in history book, gives you a single reason for which you should understand this. You must do it by yourself, right? I'm here because I don't know, I've been through the thing and I think it's important, and so I can help, hopefully, for anyone that wants to understand the stuff better. Because you understand there's so much, right, that it's almost embarrassing, itself. I mean, you can't quite make sense of anything until you see it, and so it's a process, it takes time. And I think the history of the Mendicant Orders is very fine account, especially on making more monastic history, especially in the early Middle Ages, because we didn't do again much about the Benedictines, etc. But if you look at our Christian playlist, it's pretty big, fortunately. At least that's one of the few things I'm comforted by. At least, if I die, that there is enough stuff for people out there to sort of have, at this point, said something. 162 videos, 63 with this one. It's definitely something that you can appreciate. I hope in the variety of it, because most Christian history I make is medieval stuff. You understand that. And I didn't do so much after all. If you look at a couple of years ago, barely more than than 60. Well, it's always like you always have to study it carefully. This yes, I remember always this Umberto Roman and the universal control over urban spirituality. Made a video that perfectly matches with today's one, and that's a great example of the guy's work. And this kind of Mendicant Order members that really left their own impact. Who does remember Umberto of Roman? You should, right? It's those important things you can't really do without, or you can do it without, but it make it more difficult. There's nothing you can't really do without. Just browsing playlist. And, well. After all, we got some views, right? And we will hopefully get some more over time. Well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.